It's so interesting, isn't it? Because at the end of the day, we are dealing with individuals, whether we're talking about the CEOs of companies or the cleaners, and how they show up to work is a very individual experience.
Yeah, and I still think we scratch the surface. At least we're having conversations today. And we've in Australia. Australia is in my opinion, very far ahead of the curve in terms of the conversations and the level of maturity around mental health. And it does differ culturally from country to country, where it can be an open conversation. But as you correctly said earlier on, men, we're not always an open book. I know some people doing some great work in that space around men's health, and to particularly make environments where it's easier for men to go and have conversations. I've never come across the concept of the man sheds, which they've got in Australia, which is a great mental health initiative. So the conversation started. It needs to go a lot further, and it needs to become normalised. And the organisations that I've worked in where I've put in mental health strategies, the usual challenge with the project is what does success look like? What are we trying to achieve? And the only thing I ever try and achieve is to instill a culture in an organisation where it's a normal conversation to talk about your anxiety or your mental health challenge in the same way you would talk about the cruciate ligament that you pulled kicking the footy with the kids at the weekend. It's normalising that conversation really, Ron.
It's one of the interesting things. I mean, I've observed as a father watching my daughters grow up and watching my nephews grow up as well, and having grown up as a boy and a man myself, to see how different play is at a very young age and how that prepares us and gives us the vocabulary almost. Because I know my wife, and still to this day, will say to me, "What's wrong?" And I'll go, "Nothing." And she knows something's wrong. And it actually takes me a day or two for me to articulate in my own head. This is a conversation going on in my own head, even to this day, about what is wrong. And I just don't. I think this man shed thing. We did a program on the man cave, which is addressing that in young teenagers and school children, but we just don't have that. We're better off talking about the cruciate ligament, aren't we?
Oh, it's a much more comfortable conversation to have, really. And look, as a species, generally we avoid difficult situations. That's how we've evolved as a species. And now we're asking people to go and have challenging conversations. That it's a really good thing to start the conversation, but we're not always best equipping people to close those conversations out. And that's a challenge that's across all gender really, but men particularly, we can be slow to start that conversation and to eventuate it for sure.
It could also explain why our life expectancy is a little bit shorter than women's, but there could be a few other factors there.
I'll leave that to your medical expertise, and I won't get myself in a world of trouble by.
When you were OH&S at this nuclear plant, and you were in that for quite a few years, I'm assuming, what was some of the initiatives when you did start that conversation? 15 or 20 years ago. What was some of the initiatives early on that tried to address those? Because it's interesting to see how they may have changed over the years.
I think it's things that we see now as more as a standard practice, and it was about what I always term as genuine consultation. So there's always been, enshrined within OHS law forever, there's always been the rights around consultation. But it was really starting the conversation with the people who are, as we used to say, on the coal face, they know what happens on night shift. I always talk about culture as three circles, and if I had my whiteboard, I would write all this out. Where if you picture there's three circles and they intertwine, and your culture sits in the middle. And this model applies not only to mental health and to many things. And the three circles of influence, really, it's what I would term as the formal organisation. So where there's policies and there's processes, the things that we write down, and then there's the second circle, really, of influence is the informal organisation. So every organisation's got an informal organisation, that's epitomised by, if you want to get that done, see Frank on the night shift or Betty on afternoon shift. She knows her way around that. And then the third part is the individual. So you got the individual and all the attributes and baggage that we all bring along on, and why we're all plumbed in different ways. There's cultural issues, there's behavioural issues, there's education. So when you think about that unholy trinity, think of it from a business point of view. How much influence have you got over the formal organisation? You've got 100%. You write the policies, you write the procedures, you run the training script. The informal only really prospers when the formal structure isn't good. The informal is just a workaround for the things that don't work. So a lot of the initiatives we put in place, it was about, well, tell us what really happens. And I used to look back on some of the IR topics of the the 80s and the 90s, where the threat was, we'll work to rule.
Mm-hmm.
We're going to follow the rules, and that was a
that was a
back
threat.
in the day. That was a legitimate industrial relation. And I always used to think, well, it's a bloody nuclear plant. I kind of hope everybody is following the rules. So yeah, you've got your informal organisation, you've got your formal organisation, then you've got the individuals. How much influence have you got over those? And we used to say, well, you sleep for a third of the day, you work for a third of the day, and hopefully for the third of the day or third of your life, you do something you enjoy. I don't think it's that simple. I think now, and I think it's commonly acknowledged now, that the workplace is the single biggest influencer on most mental health and well-being topics. So I guess that's a very, very windy answer to a short question. We concentrated a lot of initiatives around making sure we didn't need an informal organisation. And we've done that through working with the individuals that knew how things happened, and just having a long, hard stare at the formal processes and procedures. And that's what I've spent probably the rest of my career doing. People that have worked with me will be getting tired of me seeing, get it down to one page, and I want to see big text and pictures, because if you can't get somebody's attention with one page, it's unlikely they're going to read the page two, because that's how we are as humans.
Interesting to hear you say, though, that the more successful or the better the policy is, the less the informal policy has an influence. And I mean, yeah, and it's also, I'm sure there was a report just recently coming out of, I think it's UKG, which is a big HR firm, that said 70% of people that were surveyed said that their work manager had more of an influence on their mental health than their own partner, or equal to their own partner, and more than their doctor or their therapist.
Yeah, I think I've actually read that report, Ron, and it's, when you think about in the workplace, and I'll generalize a little bit, but, when I speak to people, the causes of stress and challenges to mental health in the workplace, it's not the flickering light. It's not, the forklifts make too much noise, and we've got that side of safety all boxed off, really, by and large. It's the behaviours you encounter and the things that fester. If you're working in an organisation that, I often say you're not going to address mental health with bowls of fruit on a Friday. I've never known anybody feel better after eating a banana. It just doesn't work that way. If your biggest concern in the organisation is you actually don't think you've been paid appropriately, and you haven't been for a number of years, or you've seen people not being appropriately managed when the behaviour hasn't been correct, those things can gnaw away at a person, and they can gnaw away at the fabric of an organisation. And it doesn't matter how many policies and procedures you have in place, if the behaviours, they use the term toxic, if it's a toxic organisation, that begins, and ends with leadership. If leadership is strong and authentic and understands the wellness discussion and fairness, wellness and fairness are hand in hand. If the organisation has fair practices, it has people who can be approached and you can have a reasoned conversation with. And look, none of us are right all the time, none of us are wrong all the time. But if you don't feel you can have an open conversation, especially with the people who determine, what you're going to do from now through the rest of your career potentially, that's a big problem. That's a big problem. So I do believe that. I think if you're unfortunate to have somebody who hasn't got your best interest at heart in the workplace, get out.
Yeah.
Would be my advice.